Hello, I'm Darkwell Bled, and welcome to an early Christmas Eve edition of Beyond the Rusted Gate, coming to you on a Wednesday instead of a Friday to bring you a little Christmas tale I've written just for the occasion, entitled Schrödinger's Christmas. It was the last present under the tree, and Dan Oakaman stared at it intensely. Wrapped in festive paper and finished off with a pretty bow, the parcel was ominous and threatening. The living room surrounding the package was warm and brightly lit by a roaring fire. The tree that it sat under had been decorated joyfully. Dan's family, without knowing that anything was amiss, were gathered and enjoying their Christmas celebrations. They talked and laughed and smiled, and Dan stared at the gift. The party guests consisted of Dan's 3 adult children, their partners, and their 8 kids. They were young and full of energy, and Dan was old and tired. Long ago, he had been a very popular politician. He did a lot of good work standing up for the middle class and annoying plenty of corporations. Despite his political successes, he considered those gathered, his children and many grandchildren, his greatest achievement. The children were enjoying whatever gifts they had received, and the adults were enjoying Dan's booze, and Dan was staring beneath the tree at the last Christmas present. You could tell which of the children belonged to who. The 6 kids that belonged to his 2 oldest tore around the living room, climbing on furniture and screaming, while the twin boys of Susie, his youngest daughter, sat in the corner reading quietly. Dan knew that he wasn't supposed to have favorites, but he liked the twins and their mother the most. While the other adults drank and talked loudly, Susie sat and watched the festive turmoil. She watched the children, the crackling fire, her brother and sister and their partners and hers, and she watched her father too. She watched as he stared at the tree, and she couldn't help but wonder if he was thinking about Christmases past and the family members that weren't here. Her uncle had died when she was very young. She could hardly remember him, but her father still often spoke of his brother as though he were still here. Then there was her mother. She had died 5 years ago, but at Christmas it still felt fresh. Susie could only imagine that her father felt the loss of her mother with even more intensity than she did. As far as she could tell, her parents had been inseparable, almost cartoonishly in love. They reminded her of the hand-drawn couples you could see together taking sleigh rides on old Christmas cards. Susie thought that maybe he was thinking of her now as he stared distantly at the Christmas tree. She didn't see that he was looking at the gift beneath the tree. She thought that maybe he was staring beyond the fir and the wall behind it, out through the snow and through time itself to look back at her mother. Susie was partially right. Dan was looking into the past, but he was also staring at the ribbon-wrapped parcel. The presence of the gift had caught Dan Oakaman by surprise. It had been obscured at first by larger packages, but as they were removed, it was revealed. A Christmas gift from the past that shouldn't be there. It should be hidden. Dan knew this. Dan was the one that hid it. He knew that he had left it buried in the back of his wardrobe in the same place that it had sat for years, and yet here it was. It couldn't be mistaken for any other gift. He knew every detail of the packaging, every crease of its wrappings, and every curl of its ribbon. The parcel was so familiar to him that there could be no mistaking it. Why was it here? The package had seemingly been placed under the tree alongside the rest that were, quote-unquote, brought by Santa. It stared at him accusingly. He fought to convince himself that it had been placed without malice. Surely no one knew what it was. How could they? Dan blinked and considered its placement. It was, he imagined, Susie who had in all likelihood placed the parcel under the tree. She had taken it upon herself to arrange the rest of the gifts while the others were having Christmas dinner, hoping to make sure that it was perfect for the children, and she had probably placed his secret package there out of kindness. He was getting old and dottery, and she was, no doubt, trying to be thoughtful and helpful and nice. It was addressed to him, and she probably just didn't want him to miss out. She had probably found it in his closet while tidying his room, thought that it had been given to him to open on Christmas Day, and that he had forgotten about it. Again, she was only partially mistaken. It had been given to him for Christmas, but not for this Christmas, and he had certainly never forgotten. It could never be forgotten. For 25 years, Dan Oakaman had kept the package hidden in his closet, taking it out once a year on Christmas Eve to contemplate opening it or throwing it away. He had almost thrown it away that first night he'd been given it 25 years earlier, then again 15 years ago when his brother died. When his wife died 5 years ago, he'd finally made up his mind to throw it away once and for all. He'd even almost got it to the doorway of his bedroom before sighing, turning around, and resignedly placing it back in the closet. Dan's eyes were glossed and vacant as these memories passed through the living room, unseen by anyone but himself. They were visions of Christmases past, but Dan Oakaman had none of Dickens' spirits to guide him. His wife had never known about his secret parcel and yearly tradition. He knew that she didn't, or she would have surely thrown it away herself years ago. There was only one person beyond Dan who had definitely known about the parcel, and they had been dead for 25 years. It wasn't a pleasant memory. Nothing surrounding the pretty parcel was pleasant. They were dark thoughts that were easy to get lost in, and Dan could have remained wandering aimlessly all night had one of Susie's boys not snapped him out of it with a distant question. "Huh?" asked Dan, blinking and unsure what had been said. "The last one's for you, Grandpa," the child repeated. In his small hands, the child held the package, which Dan deftly took. The boy had a genuine smile, and Dan knew that, while Susie had no doubt prompted the boy to bring him the gift, the child had likely been all too happy to help out. He was a good kid with a good heart. They all were. His family had flaws, for sure, but they were his family, and so they were, in his eyes, perfect. They were all looking at him expectantly, and he shook the gift softly as though he were holding it for the first time. It felt like it contained papers, photographs, perhaps. Probably not many of them, but enough. He had deduced this many times before. He remembered what the man had said when he'd presented him with the gift on Christmas Eve 25 years earlier. "Open this when you're alone. Think about it. Then we can discuss in the new year what you'd be willing to do for the originals." The man had been, in Dan's mind, a sleazy blackmailer, no doubt working for one of the many corporations his political career had caused difficulties. Dan didn't have anything to hide, and that was what had worried him. As a career politician, he knew that if they weren't coming for him, then they were coming for his family. He hadn't wanted whatever the package contained to ruin his Christmas, and so he had buried it in the back of his closet to worry about in the days afterwards. But Dan had never opened the package, and had never had to consider what he'd do to keep it out of the public eye. He hadn't needed to. The blackmailer was found dead before Dan was given the chance. Dan was not upset that the sleazy man had died. Even a good Christian like himself would be hard-pressed to mourn a man that was threatening his family. When the police came by that Christmas morning saying that a body had been found with vaguely stated ties to Dan's family, he had felt a little guilty about stretching the truth with them. It hadn't been a complete lie, the things he told the police. His wife might have been home all night like he told them. Theirs was a big house, and they often didn't share a bed anyway. The police had seemed satisfied regardless and left wishing him a Merry Christmas. For 25 years he had expected to hear more about it, from the police or from whoever had hired the blackmailer or from his wife, but it was never brought up again. His wife was either never questioned herself or never mentioned it to him, and the police never came back and no further blackmail threats were ever issued or alluded to. Perhaps the death of their middleman put them off, or perhaps Dan announcing on New Year's Day his long-planned intention to retire had made their plans for him moot. "Well, Gramps, aren't you going to open it?" the other twin now chimed in, and Dan looked up at his smiling family. Who could really say for certain if his wife had gone out that night on Christmas Eve 25 years earlier? Dan certainly couldn't. Nor could he explain why he had seen her burning her clothes in this very fireplace they were now gathered around, or whether the dark stains he'd seen on the garments were blood or just spilled Christmas pudding. "Come on, Pops," encouraged Susie, but Dan Oakley shook his head and placed the package beside him. It wasn't lost on him that Susie was so unlike her other siblings in looks and behavior, or that her twins looked identical to how his brother had looked at their age, or how close his brother and wife had been up until his brother's death. The blackmailer's package could hold anything or nothing. Evidence that could shatter a family and destroy memories of loved ones, or perhaps something overblown that even back then could have been scoffed at and ignored. "Well?" asked Susie with a glint in her eyes that reminded him of his beloved brother and a smile that reminded him of his perfect wife. "Won't you open it?" "Not this one," said Dan, shaking his head. "It's just a silly old decoration. Really, I should just throw it away." Thanks for listening. That was Schrödinger's Christmas, which is currently not available in print anywhere, as I wrote it just last week for this show. But if you do want any of my other writings, I have 2 collections of short stories available in print, Screams from the Crypt and Screams from Beyond the Crypt, as well as a novella called Darkwell Bled's The Soul Weaver, which are all available in paperback from most online book distributors. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider liking it and sharing it with someone you think might find it interesting. With all of that said and done, have a very Merry Christmas. I am Darkwell Bled, and I will see you in the new year with new stories.